To speak to all the primary schools and the students who took part in this Christmas card competition. I think that's an inspiration to all of us, perhaps for our Christmas cards as well. But undoubtedly, we are going to ensure that we need to ensure that climate action continues to be raised as an issue, and we all have a role to play.
Congratulate the President of COP26 for his personal dedication, hard work and commitment at the Glasgow summit. Can he confirm to the House that as a result of the summit, for the first time ever, over 90% of the world's GDP and around 90% of global emissions are now covered for the first time by net emissions targets, and that all 197 countries have pledged to revisit and strengthen these targets by the time of COP27 next year?
Mr. Speaker, my thanks again to my honourable friend for his kind words. He's absolutely right. When we took on the COP presidency, less than 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero target. We're now at 90%. And yes, all countries have agreed to look again at their 2030 emission reduction targets and come back on those by the end of 2022 to ensure they're aligned with the Paris temperature goals.
Paul Blomfield.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And following on from that point, it was indeed one of the positive outcomes of COP26 that was the agreement for countries to revise their emissions targets next year. But could the President explain exactly what is he going to do over the next 12 months to make sure that we get the breakthrough we need at COP27, not only to keep 1.5 alive, but to actually achieve it?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's a very, very fair question, and as I said, what I will do is set out for the House in due course, by way of a written statement, precisely what we will do in our presidency year. But as he knows, significant number of commitments were made by countries at COP26, and our intention is to ensure that they deliver on the commitments that they have made.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. No one doubts the commitment of the Secretary of State to delivering on climate change. But can he say what he intends to do over the next 12 months? Because the pledges that were made at COP26 must have been alarming to him, because we are way off delivering on 1.5 on current pledges, and the achievements that the countries will make by 2030 will be way off of target. So what is he going to do to step up his activities as President for the next year to ensure we get back on target to keep 1.5 alive?
But, Mr. Speaker, as I said, I will set this out in writing, but I would just say to him that if we look at all the commitments that have been made, including the net zero commitments by countries, the long-term strategies, there are credible reports that suggest that we are heading to below 2 degrees. But of course, this is a start of a decade of action, and that's why we need to push forward during this year.
Lib Dem.
Does he believe that the current structure of government is adequate to ensure that the UK can deliver a more ambitious NDC at COP27?
Mr. Speaker, the makeup of government and the structures of government obviously are a matter for the Prime Minister, and I know he will have raised this issue at the Liaison Committee. But specifically on the NDC, of course, we have a current NDC which is aligned to net zero.
Says Secretary Edmund.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to commend the COP President, or should I say no drama Sharma, for the efforts he made in Glasgow. He is right that we have to spend the next 12 months maximising the pressure on the big emitters, and we can make a difference with the UK-Australia trade deal, because Australia's 2030 target is consistent with 4 degrees of warming. So will he tell the Trade Secretary to rewrite that trade deal, not to water down commitments, which is the current plan, but to make it conditional on Australia, as well as the UK, having 2030 targets consistent with 1.5 degrees?
President?
Mr. Speaker, can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his new role? My only disappointment is that the phrase shadow COP President doesn't appear in his title, but this is where I think he can take some lessons from the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party about how to expand the number of portfolios you've got. But specifically on the point of Australia, can I just confirm to him that the trade deal will include a substantive chapter on climate change, which reaffirms both parties' commitments to upholding our obligations under the Paris Agreement, including limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know I am shadowing the department that he would quite like to run, so maybe that will be an announcement that is forthcoming in the future, and I'm mildly encouraged by what he says on Australia. Let me take two other issues where he can show leadership. The Cumbria coal mine and the Cambo oil field, the equivalent of 18 coal-fired power stations running for a year. He knows that we need to get others to phase out coal. He knows we need to phase out fossil fuels. Surely the right way to send the proper signal to the rest of the world ahead of COP27 is for the whole of the government to start practicing what he is effectively preaching and put a stop to Cambo and Cumbria.
Mr. Speaker, I just say to him, and we've had this discussion in the dispatch box previously, both in terms of Canberra and Cumbria, he will know that they're being looked at by independent regulators and there will be pronouncements coming forward. More specifically, in terms of coal, of course, we have reduced significantly the amount of coal on our electricity mix. In fact, there will be no more coal in the electricity mix in the UK from 2024.
SNP spokesperson Deirdre.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I commend the President and his team for all their hard work over COP26. But one issue missing from the Prime Minister's ambition for COP26 was fossil fuels generally. It's clear we need action to tackle the use of fossil fuels globally, but to do so in a way that supports a just transition for workers. Does the President agree that not having a concrete commitment from COP for a global just transition from fossil fuels is a disappointment, and that following the Scottish Government's example in delivering a just transition and opposing further oil exploration would set a strong example for the next COP?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we do support a just transition. In fact, the deal that was agreed with South Africa, the $8.5 billion deal agreed with South Africa, will enable decarbonisation and a just transition in that country. And we also now have 34 countries and 5 public finance institutions which are supporting a UK-led initiative to end international public support for unabated fossil fuel energy sector by the end of 2022.
Number 5, please.
President. Mr. Speaker, at COP26, leaders of countries representing over 70% of global GDP committed to work together to make clean technologies and sustainable solutions the most affordable, accessible and attractive option in each emitting sector before the end of this decade.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Teesside is quickly becoming the epicentre for hydrogen technology in the UK, with recent announcements on blue and green hydrogen production. We are confident that Teesside will be able to deliver more than half of the government's 2030 hydrogen ambitions. Around 85% of all homes are on the gas network, and domestic heating accounts for over 30% of the UK's CO2 emissions. It's clear to me that we won't make net zero without switching our gas network to 100% hydrogen. So can the Minister recognise hydrogen as a fuel of the future, and will he join me in my campaign for the UK's first hydrogen village in Redcar?
Mr. Speaker, I agree with my honourable friend. Hydrogen is a fuel of the future, and as he will know, that the idea of a hydrogen village trial was proposed in the Prime Minister's 10-point plan, and indeed gas network companies are working with local partners to develop proposals for the trial. Could I suggest he speaks to my right honourable friend, the Business Secretary, to make the case for Redcar as well?
Martin Docker to use.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The territories of the world's 370 million indigenous peoples cover 24%. Number 6, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, indigenous people's voices were represented throughout COP26, and of course the UK government funded the Indigenous Peoples Pavilion in the Blue Zone. We will continue to amplify indigenous people's voices during our presidency year.
Martin Docker to use.
I'm grateful for the President's response. The territories, as I was saying, of the world's 370 million indigenous people cover 24% of the land of the world worldwide and contain 80% of the world's biodiversity, including sites of precious natural resources. It's they who protect forests vulnerable to the encroachment of modernity, which has caused climate change. Therefore, does the President agree that given indigenous communities are successful in maintaining control of their territories and traditions against the onslaught of man-made climate change, it's time for them to be treated as equal partners in decision-making processes, including United Nations?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I said, we will absolutely amplify the voice of indigenous peoples, but as you will also know, the UK worked with others to mobilise a pledge of at least $1.7 billion over the next 5 years to ensure that there is support for indigenous peoples, particularly when it comes to forest tenure rights.
Mike Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COP26 agreed that...
But I agree.
Number 9. Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 9 and 13 together. We can say with credibility that at COP26 we kept 1.5 degrees alive, but as I acknowledged in Glasgow and indeed here, its pulse is weak, and that is why we now need to turn commitments from countries into action.
I'm Moran.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. COP26 agreed that the Paris Climate Agreement must now be implemented to keep global warming below 1.5. But it's been revealed that the UK has emitted around 50 million tonnes of carbon in the past 5 years from collapsing peatlands alone. I asked the Minister this last time, and I'll ask him again. Where is the climate leadership in this government in allowing 2/3 of UK peatlands to be burnt while the world is on fire?
President.
Mr. Speaker, as you will know, we do have a peat strategy, which I'm sure my colleagues in DEFRA would be happy to share with her. But I would just say more widely is that as a country, we have decarbonised our economy faster in recent years than any other G7 or G20 nation.
Clive Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We know the oil of Cambo and the coal of Cumbria have to stay in the ground if we're to keep temperatures at below 2.4 degrees centigrade. And I say 2.4 degrees centigrade because that's the new reality after this year's COP26. So, will the COP President commit to stopping Cambo and the new coal mine in Cumbria and end the climate hypocrisy that so undermined his presidency at COP26?
Mr. Speaker, I responded to the honourable gentleman earlier on the issue of Cambo and Cumbria. I would just say to him more generally that I recognise that we need to work very hard during our presidency here to ensure that commitments by all countries are turned into action. That's what we will be doing.
Andy Carter.
Topic order number 1, please, Mr. Speaker.
President.
Mr. Speaker, at COP26 we won historic commitments from countries and businesses to act on coals, cars, cash and trees. Countries have also committed to revisit and strengthen by the end of 2022 their 2030 emission reduction commitments to align with the Paris temperature goals. And after 6 years we finalised the outstanding rules governing the Paris Agreement. But of course, as I've said, we need to ensure that commitments are turned into action.
Andy Carter.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I congratulate my right honourable friend on his incredible work at the COP26 summit in Glasgow? And will my right honourable friend continue to work with schools and youth groups through the rest of his presidency? And can I invite him to Warrington to come and meet some young people in my constituency?
Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for his kind words, and of